They never told you this on purpose. Not because it was too complicated. Not because you were too young. But because if you understood how money actually works early, you'd ask very uncomfortable questions later. Think about it. 12 years of school. Thousands of hours. You learned algebra you never use. History dates you forgot. Rules you memorized just to pass tests. But no one sat you down and explained how debt really works. No one showed you how interest compounds against you. No one explained why two people earning the same salary can end up living completely different lives. That wasn't an accident. You were told to work hard, to get a good job, to save a little, and somehow, everything else was supposed to work itself out. Meanwhile, the moment you turned 18, banks were ready. Credit cards, loans, financing, fine print. You were considered responsible enough to sign contracts that could shape the next 40 years of your life, but apparently not responsible enough to be taught what those contracts actually do. If you've ever felt like money stress just quietly followed you into adulthood, this is why. And here's the part that really matters. Most people don't fail financially because they make one massive mistake. They fail because of tiny decisions repeated over decades. Decisions they didn't even know were decisions. Now let me tell you why you should keep listening. I've seen how the system works from the inside. I've watched how wealth is built quietly, boringly, consistently. And I've watched how it's drained just as quietly through ignorance, not stupidity. The gap between people who feel calm about money and people who feel trapped isn't talent. It's not intelligence. It's not even income. It's knowledge and timing. If you don't understand how money moves, time becomes your enemy. If you do, time becomes your biggest advantage. Here's what no one tells you early enough. A few small misunderstandings in your 20s don't feel dangerous. In your 30s, they feel annoying. In your 40s, they feel heavy. And in your 50s, they feel irreversible. The cost of not knowing isn't dramatic at first. It's subtle. It's the extra years you have to work, the stress you normalize, the choices you don't feel allowed to make. It's the job you can't leave, the risk you can't take, the constant feeling that you're one bad month away from trouble. And the worst part, most people blame themselves. They think they're bad with money, undisciplined, behind. But you were never given the full picture. This isn't about getting rich. It's about not being trapped. In the next hour, I'm going to walk you through the financial literacy that quietly disappeared from schools. Not theory. Not hype. Not shortcuts. A framework. A way to think. A system that actually fits real life. You won't need to be good at math. You won't need to already have money. And you won't need to change who you are. But you will start seeing your past decisions differently, your current situation differently, and your future as something you can actually influence. If you stay until the end, you'll have a clear roadmap. Not motivation. Not inspiration. Clarity. The kind that makes things click. The kind that replaces anxiety with control. Most people never get this explanation all in one place. Once you see it, you can't unsee it. Stay with me. I want to start by telling you exactly why you should listen to what I'm about to share, because I know the internet is full of financial advice, hot takes, and people telling you what you should or shouldn't do with your money. And if you're anything like most people, you've probably felt overwhelmed by it at some point or quietly thought, this isn't for me, or I'll deal with this later when I'm earning more, or I'm just not a money person. I want to meet you exactly where you are before we go any further. I spent 9 years working in investment banking. I studied finance at university. I trained as a professional accountant. I worked inside the system where money is structured, moved, protected, and multiplied at scale. I sat in rooms where the decisions being made quietly affected markets, pensions, companies, and entire industries. I saw firsthand how the top 1% think about money, not just in terms of investments, but in terms of systems, priorities, and long-term planning. And here's the part that surprised me the most. The strategies they use are not complicated. They're not secret formulas. They're not based on genius-level math or insider tricks. They're based on clarity, consistency, and understanding a few foundational principles that almost no one is ever taught. After all of that training, all of those credentials, and all of that exposure, I realized something uncomfortable. The reason most people struggle financially isn't because they're irresponsible, lazy, or bad with money. It's because no one ever gave them a simple, honest roadmap. Instead, they were given fragments, a bit of advice here, a warning there, a lot of shame, and a lot of silence around the things that actually matter. What I'm about to walk you through in this video is everything I wish I had been taught earlier. It's everything I watched wealthy individuals do differently, often without even realizing they were doing it. And it's designed so that you don't need to already be good with money to benefit from it. You don't need to be rich. You don't need to love numbers. You don't need to track every single cent or become obsessed with spreadsheets. What you need is a framework that makes sense, fits around your life, and helps you make better decisions without constantly feeling deprived or behind. If you've ever felt like finance content wasn't meant for you, that it was either too basic to be useful or too complex to be realistic, I want you to know that this is different. This isn't about telling you what you should have done 10 years ago. It's not about comparing yourself to someone else's highlight reel. It's not about turning you into a day trader or convincing you to take risks you don't understand. This is about building a solid foundation, starting from wherever you are right now, and moving forward with intention. One of the biggest myths around money is that you need to earn a lot before any of this matters. That once you hit a certain income level, then you'll start caring, then you'll get organized, then you'll invest, then you'll plan. In reality, the habits and decisions you make with a smaller income are the exact same ones that determine whether a larger income actually changes your life. I've seen people earning six figures who are one unexpected expense away from stress, and I've seen people on modest salaries who are calm, prepared, and steadily building freedom. The difference isn't intelligence. It's structure. Another myth is that you have to be good at math to manage your money well. You don't. You need to be good at asking the right questions and honest enough to look at the answers. Most of what we'll cover is about direction, not precision. It's about understanding where your money is going, what it's doing for you, and whether it's aligned with the life you actually want to live. You don't need complex formulas for that. You need visibility. By the end of this video, you'll understand exactly where you stand financially, even if you've never looked at your numbers properly before. You'll know how to deal with debt in a way that reduces stress instead of increasing it. You'll know how to set financial goals that actually mean something, not vague ideas you feel guilty about every January. You'll understand when saving makes sense, when investing makes sense, and why timing matters more than most people realize. You'll also know how to avoid some of the biggest wealth traps that quietly keep people stuck for decades, even when they feel like they're doing everything right. More importantly, you'll have a roadmap. Not a rigid plan that falls apart the moment life changes, but a framework you can come back to again and again as your income grows, your priorities shift, and your circumstances evolve. This is something you can build on, not something you have to constantly restart. Before we get into strategies, tools, or decisions, there's one thing we need to do first, and this is the part most people skip. It's also the part that makes everything else work. We need to get honest. Not judgmental, not dramatic, just honest. Because if you don't know where you're starting from, every piece of advice sounds either inspiring or overwhelming, but never actionable. This isn't about criticizing past choices. You made the best decisions you could with the information, pressure, and responsibilities you had at the time. That's true for everyone. What matters is what you do once you can see clearly. Clarity changes behavior almost automatically. When you know what's actually happening with your money, you stop guessing. You stop reacting. You stop feeling like you're behind without knowing why. If you've been avoiding your bank statements, your balances, or your debt numbers because they make you anxious, that's normal. If you've told yourself you'll look at it properly soon, that's normal too. This isn't about forcing discipline. It's about creating understanding. And understanding is what gives you options. So take a breath. You don't need to have anything figured out yet. You don't need to pause this video and fix your life. All you need to do is stay with me for the next part, because we're going to start exactly where real financial progress always starts, with a clear, honest snapshot of where you are right now. Before we talk about changing anything, before we talk about strategies or plans or what you should do next, we need to deal with one uncomfortable truth. Most people have no idea what their financial reality actually looks like. Not roughly, not approximately, actually. And that's not because they're careless. It's because no one ever showed them how to look at it in a way that's simple, honest, and useful. When people say things like, "I'm bad with money," or "I just can't seem to get ahead," what they're usually describing isn't a lack of effort. It's operating without visibility. Imagine trying to drive somewhere new without a map, without a GPS, and without even knowing how much fuel is in your tank. You might still move forward, but you'll feel tense the entire time, and every unexpected turn will feel like a crisis. That's how most people experience their finances. So the first thing we're going to do is remove the guesswork. This part can feel uncomfortable because it strips away stories and replaces them with numbers. But numbers aren't here to judge you. They're here to tell you the truth so you can make better decisions. And once you see that truth clearly, a lot of the anxiety you've been carrying starts to dissolve on its own. I want you to zoom out and stop thinking month to month for a moment. Monthly views hide patterns. They smooth over problems. They make things feel manageable when they're not, and chaotic when they don't need to be. The most honest snapshot of your finances is a yearly one, because it captures everything. The predictable bills, the irregular expenses, the surprises, the just this once spending that happens every single year. This isn't about perfection. It's about accuracy. There are 3 numbers you need to know. Not 20. Not a complicated dashboard. Just 3. Your net income for the year, your total expenses for the year, and the difference between the two. That difference is everything. Tells you whether you're moving forward, standing still, or slowly drifting backwards without realizing it. Start with your net income. This is the money that actually lands in your account after tax. Not your salary on paper. Not what you wish you earned. What you actually receive. Include everything. Your main job, side work, freelance income, bonuses, dividends, rental income, interest. Add it all up for the year. If you're paid monthly, multiply by 12. If your income fluctuates, look back at the last year and calculate the total. Don't round it to make it feel nicer. Precision matters here. Now look at your expenses for the year. This is where people tend to underestimate. Go through your bank statements, your credit card statements, your apps, whatever you use. Include the obvious things like rent, utilities, groceries, transport, but also include the things you forget. Annual subscriptions, insurance renewals, holidays, gifts, repairs, medical costs, random purchases that didn't feel significant at the time. This isn't about cutting anything yet. Just capture it honestly. Once you subtract your expenses from your income, you'll land on one number. If that number is negative, you're in an income deficit. That means over the course of a year, you're spending more than you earn. Even if it doesn't feel dramatic month to month, over time this quietly erodes savings, increases debt, and adds stress. If that number is positive, that's your income surplus. That's the money left over after life happens. And the size of that surplus determines how fast you can change your future. Pause here if you need to. This alone is a powerful moment. For a lot of people, this is the first time they've seen their finances laid out clearly without judgment. If you're feeling a bit uneasy, that's normal. Awareness always comes before change, and awareness can feel confronting. But clarity is a relief disguised as discomfort. One important thing to understand is that savings and investments, while not technically expenses, should be treated as such at this stage. When you count them as expenses, you're acknowledging that paying your future self is non-negotiable. It also helps you see what level of saving you've been able to maintain consistently, not just in good months. That consistency matters more than big bursts of motivation. Now let's talk about net worth, because this is another number that carries a lot of emotional weight but very little explanation. Net worth is simply what you own minus what you owe. That's it. Assets minus liabilities. Assets are things that have value and, ideally, either hold or grow in value over time. Savings, investments, property. Liabilities are obligations that take money out of your pocket. Mortgages, loans, credit card balances, personal debt. A lot of people avoid calculating their net worth because they're afraid of the number. But the number itself doesn't define you. It's just a snapshot. What matters is the direction it moves from this point forward. Someone with a negative net worth who's consistently improving it is in a stronger position than someone with a high net worth who's quietly eroding it through poor decisions. Here's the key shift. Income pays for your lifestyle, but net worth buys your freedom. Income determines how you live right now. Net worth determines how much control you have over your future. And every financial decision you make, whether you realize it or not, pushes that number in one direction or the other. This lens changes everything. Buying something isn't just about whether you can afford the monthly payment. It's about whether it builds an asset or adds a liability. It's about whether it moves you closer to freedom or further away from it. Once you start thinking this way, money stops feeling like a constant juggling act and starts feeling like a tool. Another layer that often gets ignored, but is just as important as the numbers, is your relationship with money. Your money personality. The way you think about money affects how you spend, save, invest, and even how much risk feels tolerable to you. This isn't about labeling yourself in a limiting way. It's about understanding your natural tendencies so you can work with them instead of against them. Some people love living in the moment. They value experiences, generosity, enjoyment. Others are highly goal-oriented, planning-focused, always thinking ahead. Some prioritize simplicity and security, while others are practical and cautious, preferring steady, predictable choices. And some are deeply social, seeing money as a way to create memories and connections. None of these are right or wrong. Problems arise when your financial strategy clashes with who you are. If you try to follow a system that doesn't fit your personality, it won't last. You'll feel restricted, rebellious, or burnt out. But when your strategy aligns with your natural tendencies, everything feels easier. Saving feels less like deprivation. Investing feels less scary. Decisions feel clearer. Take a moment to reflect on this. You don't need to take a quiz right now if you don't want to. Just think about your habits. When you get extra money, what's your instinct? Do you spend it, save it, plan it, or stress about it? When markets fluctuate, do you feel calm or anxious? When you think about the future, do you feel excited or overwhelmed? These patterns matter. What's happening right now is subtle but important. You're moving from operating on autopilot to operating with intention. You're replacing vague feelings with concrete understanding. That's why this part of the process feels heavier than the rest. It asks you to stop avoiding and start observing. But once you do, things get lighter. If you're realizing that you've been operating blind, that's not a failure. That's the starting line. Most people never even get this far. They jump straight to advice, hacks, and shortcuts without understanding their foundation. You're doing the opposite. You're building from the ground up. And now that you can see where you are, the next question becomes unavoidable. What do you do with this information? Because clarity without action eventually turns back into frustration. In the next part, we're going to take this awareness and turn it into momentum, starting with one of the biggest sources of stress and stagnation in most people's financial lives: debt. Now that you can actually see where you stand, the next thing we need to deal with is the part of personal finance that carries the most emotional weight for most people: debt. Debt is one of those topics that people either avoid completely or obsess over, but rarely approach calmly and strategically. And that's a problem because debt itself isn't inherently good or bad. It's a tool. Like any tool, it can be used to build something solid, or it can quietly damage the foundation if it's used without understanding. One of the biggest mistakes people make is treating all debt as the same. They lump everything together and label it as failure, or they normalize all of it and tell themselves it's just part of life. Neither of those perspectives is helpful. What actually matters is what the debt is doing to your future. Some types of debt can, under the right conditions, help you move forward. Think about a student loan that significantly increases your earning potential, or a mortgage that helps you own an asset that may appreciate over time. These types of debt are often structured over long periods, usually with lower interest rates, and they're tied to something that can either generate income or reduce long-term living costs. Managed properly, they can be part of a broader strategy. Other types of debt work in the opposite direction. High-interest credit cards, payday loans, short-term financing deals for things that lose value quickly. These debts don't build anything. They siphon money away from your future and redirect it to interest payments. They make everything else harder. The key difference isn't how common the debt is, or how socially acceptable it feels. The difference is whether it's helping you build assets or quietly expanding your liabilities. Once you understand that distinction, the conversation around debt changes. It stops being emotional and starts being practical. Instead of thinking, I'm bad with money, you start thinking, this particular debt is costing me more than it's giving me. That's a solvable problem. The next step is visibility. Debt feels overwhelming when it's vague. When it lives in different apps, statements, and mental avoidance loops, it grows in your head. The moment you bring it all into one place, it shrinks. Not because the numbers change, but because you're no longer guessing. You need to list every single debt you have. All of it. Credit cards, personal loans, car loans, student loans, anything that has a balance attached to it. For each one, write down the total amount owed, the interest rate, the minimum payment, the due date, and any special conditions like introductory rates or payment holidays. Don't rush this. Don't approximate. Accuracy here gives you leverage. When everything is laid out in front of you, something interesting happens. The fear becomes specific. And specific problems are much easier to solve than vague ones. You can see which debts are actually dangerous and which ones are just sitting there quietly. You can see which balances are small wins waiting to happen and which ones need a long-term plan. At this point, people often ask which debt they should pay off first. There are two main approaches, and both work if you understand what they're optimizing for. The first is the debt avalanche. With this method, you rank your debts from highest interest rate to lowest. You pay the minimum on everything except the one with the highest interest, and you throw every extra dollar you can at that top debt until it's gone. Then you move to the next one. Mathematically, this approach is the most efficient. It minimizes the total amount of interest you pay over time. If you're comfortable with numbers and motivated by logic, this method makes a lot of sense. You're essentially plugging the biggest leaks in your financial bucket first. The second approach is the debt snowball. Here, you rank your debts from smallest balance to largest, regardless of interest rate. You focus on clearing the smallest balance first, then roll that payment into the next one, and so on. This method isn't about math. It's about momentum. Each cleared balance gives you a psychological win, which builds confidence and motivation. If you're someone who feels discouraged easily or has struggled to stick with repayment plans in the past, the snowball method can be incredibly effective. Progress you can see and feel is powerful. The important thing is not which method is objectively better, but which one you're more likely to follow consistently. Doing nothing is the only option that guarantees failure. Both strategies move you forward. Choose the one that helps you take action and stick with it. There are also tactical tools that can help, especially when it comes to high-interest credit card debt. Balance transfer cards, for example, allow you to move existing balances onto a new card with a temporary 0% interest period. This doesn't erase the debt, but it stops interest from piling on while you pay it down. Used carefully, it can give you breathing room. Used carelessly, it can delay the problem. The key is having a clear plan before the promotional period ends. This brings us to credit cards more broadly, because how you use them shapes your financial habits in ways that aren't always obvious. A debit card spends your own money. A credit card spends the bank's money. That distinction matters. When you use a credit card, you're borrowing even if it doesn't feel like it. If you pay the balance in full every month, you can benefit from rewards, points, or cash back without paying interest. In that case, the credit card is working for you. But if you carry a balance month to month, the dynamic flips. You're paying for the privilege of spending money you didn't have yet. Over time, that interest compounds against you, and purchases that once felt small become surprisingly expensive. A simple rule helps here. If you can't afford to buy something outright with cash, you probably shouldn't be buying it on credit either. There are exceptions like education, healthcare, or assets that support long-term goals. But for everyday spending, debt should not be filling the gap between desire and affordability. What's important to understand is that clearing debt, while powerful, is not the end goal. It's a step, a necessary one, but not sufficient on its own. You can be completely debt-free and still be financially vulnerable if you don't build anything alongside it. Debt reduction creates space. What you do with that space determines whether your life actually changes. This is where many people stall. They focus all their energy on paying things off, but they don't redirect that energy toward building assets or systems once the debt is gone. The result is relief without progress. Calm without momentum. What you should be feeling right now is a shift. Not excitement necessarily, but steadiness. A sense that this is manageable. That you're no longer reacting blindly, but making deliberate moves. You're starting to see how structure replaces stress. Debt stops being a moral judgment and starts being a logistical problem. And logistical problems can be solved with plans, timelines, and consistency. Now that fear has been replaced with strategy, we can zoom out again. Because while reducing debt removes friction, it doesn't define where you're going. To do that, we need to talk about something that changes the entire way you think about money, risk, and patience. We need to talk about time. At this point, once you've faced your numbers and put structure around debt, a new question naturally starts to surface. What am I actually building toward? Because without an answer to that, even the best financial habits eventually feel hollow. Saving without a purpose feels restrictive. Investing without direction feels risky. And effort without a destination slowly drains motivation. This is where most people get stuck, not because they don't want a better future, but because they've never been taught how to translate vague desires into usable plans. Saying, I want to be financially free or I want to retire comfortably sounds good, but it doesn't guide decisions. Goals without timelines are fantasies. They live in your head, not in your calendar. And money doesn't respond to intention alone. It responds to structure. The moment you attach a timeline to a goal, everything changes. The same goal with a different time frame becomes a completely different financial problem to solve. Wanting something next year versus wanting it in 20 years requires a totally different approach. Without that clarity, people either take too much risk too early or avoid risk entirely for too long. So I want you to pause mentally and think about the goals you care about. Not what you think you should want, but what actually matters to you. More time, less stress, stability, options, experiences, security, independence. Once you've named them, the next step is deceptively simple. When? This is where the time horizon framework comes in, and it's one of the most important concepts in personal finance. You can group every financial goal into one of three buckets based on when you'll need the money. Short-term, medium-term, and long-term. This isn't about optimism or pessimism. It's about matching the job your money needs to do with the environment you put it in. Short-term goals are anything happening within the next 5 years. Emergency funds, upcoming holidays, large purchases, house deposits if they're coming up soon. This money has one primary job: be there when you need it. Growth is not the priority here. Safety and accessibility are. Putting short-term money into volatile investments is how people get burned and swear off investing forever. Medium-term goals sit roughly between 5 and 15 years away. Maybe upgrading your home, starting a business, funding education. This is where things start to shift. You have time on your side, but not unlimited time. Here, money needs to work harder than it would in a savings account, but you still want to manage risk thoughtfully. This is where carefully chosen investments often start to make sense. Long-term goals are 15 years and beyond. Retirement, long-term wealth building, financial independence. This is where time becomes your greatest asset. When money has decades to grow, the short-term ups and downs of markets matter far less than people think. This is the bucket where patience is rewarded most dramatically. What most people get wrong is not investing. It's mismatching timelines. They invest short-term money and panic when markets dip. Or they leave long-term money sitting idle because they're afraid of short-term volatility. Both mistakes come from the same misunderstanding, confusing risk with uncertainty. To really understand why time matters so much, we need to talk about market history. Not in a technical way, but in a human way. Over the last century, financial markets have gone through wars, recessions, political crises, pandemics, technological revolutions, and countless moments where people were convinced the system was about to collapse. And yet, over long enough periods, markets have consistently moved upward. Here's what's fascinating. If you look at rolling 20-year periods in the stock market, historically, there has never been a case where someone invested broadly and held for at least 20 years and ended up with less money than they started with. Not once. Even in the worst 20-year stretches, returns were still positive. Most of the time, they were significantly positive. Now compare that to one-year periods. In any given year, returns are unpredictable. Some years are great. Some are terrible. Some wipe out gains temporarily. If you only look at short windows, investing feels like gambling. But when you zoom out, patterns emerge. Time smooths volatility. Time absorbs shocks. Time turns randomness into probability. This is why long-term investing works for ordinary people, not just professionals. You don't need perfect timing. You don't need to predict crashes. You need consistency and patience. The market doesn't reward brilliance as much as it rewards endurance. So why, if this data exists, are so many people afraid of investing? Because fear is emotional, not mathematical. People remember crashes more vividly than recoveries. Losses feel more painful than gains feel satisfying. And most people's first exposure to investing happens without context. They hear stories of someone losing money, or they experience a downturn early on, and they conclude that investing itself is dangerous. Another reason is that investing is often taught backwards. People are shown products before principles, stocks before timelines, returns before risk tolerance. Without understanding the role investing plays in a larger plan, it feels like stepping into the unknown. And humans are wired to avoid uncertainty, even when that avoidance costs them in the long run. There's also the issue of delayed gratification. Investing requires patience in a world that rewards immediacy. You put money in now for a benefit you won't feel for years. That's psychologically difficult, especially if you've never seen it work before. Saving feels tangible. Investing feels abstract until time does its thing. But once you understand how timelines dictate strategy, investing stops feeling reckless and starts feeling logical. You stop asking, will the market go down? And start asking, when do I need this money? That single shift changes everything. This is the point in the journey where people stop thinking in months and start thinking in years. Where decisions stop being reactive and start being intentional. Where money moves from being something you worry about to something you deploy with purpose. You don't need to predict the future. You need to respect time. When you do that, risk becomes manageable, expectations become realistic, and progress becomes almost inevitable. And now that you can see how goals, timelines, and time horizons fit together, we can finally talk about turning this understanding into something practical. Because insight alone doesn't change outcomes. Systems do. And in the next part, we're going to build the system that ties everything together and makes this sustainable in real life. This is the point where everything you've understood so far starts to move from theory into real life. Up until now, you've gained clarity, perspective, and strategy. But clarity alone doesn't change outcomes. What changes outcomes is having a system that quietly works in the background. Even when motivation fades, life gets busy, or priorities shift. And this is where budgeting comes in, even though that word has been unfairly ruined for most people. Most people think budgeting means restriction. Sounds like saying no, like tightening your life, like constantly checking yourself and feeling guilty every time you spend money on something enjoyable. But that version of budgeting is outdated and unsustainable. Real budgeting isn't about limiting your life. It's about protecting it. It's about making sure your money is aligned with what matters to you, instead of being pulled in random directions by impulse, habit, or short-term pressure. When budgeting is done properly, it actually creates freedom. Freedom to spend without guilt because you already know it fits. Freedom to save without feeling deprived because you can see what it's building toward. Freedom to stop constantly second-guessing yourself. The stress most people associate with money doesn't come from spending too much. It comes from not knowing whether their spending is sabotaging their future. To understand why budgeting works, it helps to think in terms of time instead of rules. You're no longer just managing this month. You're managing a year. And that shift is powerful. A 12-month forecast forces you to look ahead and acknowledge reality before it shows up uninvited. It turns surprises into known events. Insurance renewals, travel, weddings, holidays, big purchases. All the things that usually derail good intentions. Building a 12-month forecast isn't about predicting the future perfectly. It's about creating a baseline. You take what you know from the past year and project it forward. Income, fixed expenses, irregular costs. This becomes your if nothing changes scenario. And once you can see that, you gain control. Because now you can start adjusting deliberately instead of reacting emotionally. One of the most important shifts here is separating savings and investing from whatever money happens to be left over. When saving is treated as an afterthought, it rarely happens consistently. When it's planned up front, it becomes automatic. You decide in advance what your future deserves, instead of negotiating with yourself at the end of every month. This is where the system starts to feel real. You begin asking better questions. Can I redirect money from low-impact spending to high-impact goals? Can I reduce expenses that don't actually add value to my life? Can I smooth out big costs over the year instead of letting them shock me? This isn't about cutting everything. It's about intentional trade-offs. Once the yearly picture is clear, monthly check-ins become simple instead of stressful. You're no longer asking, where did my money go? You're asking, am I roughly on track? Small deviations are easy to fix early. A subscription you forgot about, a slightly higher bill, a month where spending crept up. These don't spiral into guilt or panic because you catch them while they're still manageable. A simple framework helps here, not because it's perfect, but because it's intuitive. Dividing your income into 3 broad categories gives you instant feedback. The essentials that keep your life running, the things that make life enjoyable, and the money that's building your future. The exact percentages don't matter as much as the awareness. You can adjust them to fit your life, your location, your priorities. What matters is that all 3 exist intentionally. When you review your month, you start asking calmer questions. Did this spending actually improve my life? If yes, great. If not, can it be reduced or replaced? Can I get the same value for less? These questions aren't restrictive. They're clarifying. Over time, they sharpen your instincts. This is also where the false tension between enjoying life now and preparing for the future starts to dissolve. You realize it's not either-or. It's both, managed intentionally. You can spend, save, and invest at the same time when there's a plan holding it all together. Naturally, this leads to the question of saving versus investing. And this is where a lot of people get stuck because they frame it as a binary choice. Should I save more or invest more? The real answer is that they serve different purposes at different stages. Saving is about protection. It gives you stability, flexibility, and peace of mind. It absorbs shocks. It prevents small problems from becoming financial emergencies. Investing is about growth. It's about making sure your money doesn't just sit still while time passes. Both matter. The key is knowing when each one should take priority. There's a simple roadmap that balances both. First, you build a small buffer, enough to handle immediate surprises. This isn't about feeling invincible. It's about breathing room. Then, you tackle high-interest debt because that kind of debt works directly against everything you're trying to build. Eliminating it is one of the highest guaranteed returns you'll ever get. Once those 2 pieces are in place, something important happens. You don't have to choose between saving and investing anymore. You can do both. You can continue building your emergency fund toward a level that makes you feel secure, while also starting to invest for long-term goals. Progress on multiple fronts is incredibly motivating. Keeps momentum alive. This is where people often underestimate themselves. They think investing only counts if it's a large amount. In reality, consistency matters far more than size at the beginning. Starting early, even with small amounts, gives you experience, confidence, and time. It turns investing from a scary idea into a normal habit. When you know your goals and timelines, investing stops being abstract. It becomes a tool assigned to specific jobs. Long-term goals get long-term strategies. Short-term money stays protected. Medium-term goals are handled thoughtfully. Everything has a place. What's happening emotionally at this stage is subtle but profound. You stop feeling like money is something that happens to you. You start feeling like it's something you manage. Your future stops feeling overwhelming and starts feeling navigable. Not perfect, not guaranteed, but understandable. This is usually the moment when people realize they don't need constant motivation anymore. The system carries them forward. Even on months when you're tired, distracted, or busy, the structure keeps working. And that's when real change becomes sustainable. You're no longer just learning about money. You're using it intentionally. You can see how today's decisions connect to future outcomes. And once you see that connection clearly, it's very hard to unsee it. The sense of relief that comes from this is often unexpected. Not excitement or adrenaline, but calm confidence. The feeling that you're no longer winging it, that you're no longer hoping things will work out. You're actively steering. And now that you've built the system, understood how saving and investing fit together, and felt what it's like to move forward with clarity, there's one final step. Bringing all of this into the context of real-life decisions. The big ones. The ones that shape decades, not months. Because knowledge and systems only matter if they help you live better. And that's where we're heading next. At this stage, once you've built awareness, structure, and momentum, the questions naturally become more specific. Not should I do something with my money? But how much should I actually be doing, and is it enough? This is where uncertainty can creep back in if you don't handle it correctly. Because numbers can feel intimidating again. But the goal here isn't precision. It's direction. When it comes to investing, the most useful way to think about it is backwards. Start with the outcome you want, then work your way back to what that requires today. Ask yourself 3 simple questions. What is the goal? How much will it cost? And when do I need it by? Those 3 answers are enough to turn a vague ambition into something measurable. Once you have a rough target amount and a timeline, you can estimate how much you'd need to invest regularly to get there, assuming a reasonable long-term rate of return. This doesn't need to be exact. It's not a contract. It's a guide. And when you compare that number to what you can realistically invest right now, you'll often see a gap. That gap is normal. Almost everyone has one. What matters is how you respond to it. The gap isn't a failure. It's information. It gives you options. You can extend the timeline slightly. You can plan to increase contributions gradually as your income grows. You can adjust expectations. Or you can look for ways to improve efficiency, whether that's through tax-advantaged accounts or better allocation. The key is that you're no longer guessing. You're making trade-offs consciously. This is also where people realize that investing isn't about hitting some magic number as quickly as possible. It's about consistency over time. Small, regular contributions compound quietly. Missed years don't just delay progress. They reduce it dramatically. Starting imperfectly is almost always better than waiting for the perfect moment. Your investment strategy should also reflect where you are in life, not just what you've read online. Time is the biggest variable here. When you're decades away from needing the money, you can afford to take more risk because you have time to recover from downturns. Volatility feels scary in the short term, but it's the price you pay for higher long-term growth. As you get closer to the point where you'll rely on that money, the focus shifts. Growth matters less than protection. The goal becomes preserving what you've built while still allowing some room for growth. This doesn't happen overnight. It's a gradual transition. Your portfolio evolves as your life does. But age alone isn't the whole story. Risk tolerance matters just as much. Some people can watch markets swing without losing sleep. Others feel anxious even with small fluctuations. Neither response is wrong. What matters is building a strategy you can stick with. The best plan on paper is useless if it causes you to panic and abandon it at the worst possible moment. Diversification plays a huge role here. Concentrating too much in one area, one asset, or one company increases risk without necessarily increasing reward. This is especially important if part of your income or compensation is already tied to a single employer. Spreading risk isn't about being pessimistic. It's about being realistic. Once you understand this, investing stops feeling like speculation and starts feeling like stewardship. You're managing resources over time, not chasing quick wins. From here, it's important to address some of the biggest financial decisions people make, often without realizing how much they impact long-term outcomes. One of the most significant is car buying. Cars are deeply emotional purchases. They're tied to identity, convenience, and lifestyle. But financially, they're one of the most common wealth killers. The problem isn't owning a car. It's overspending on one. Cars depreciate. They lose value over time, often quickly. Financing them over long periods with high interest turns a necessary expense into a long-term drag on your finances. Monthly payments can feel manageable while quietly consuming a huge portion of your future potential. Simple guidelines help here. Keeping the total cost of a car aligned with your income. Limiting loan terms so you're not paying for a car long after its value has dropped. Making meaningful down payments. Or, when possible, choosing to buy outright within a reasonable budget. These aren't rules meant to strip enjoyment. They're guardrails that prevent a single decision from dominating your financial life for years. Delayed gratification plays a powerful role here. Choosing a less expensive car now can create the space to afford something better later, without stress or debt. It's one of the clearest examples of how short-term restraint can translate into long-term freedom. Another decision that shapes decades is whether to rent or buy a home. This debate is often framed as purely financial, but that misses half the picture. There are real financial considerations, and there are equally real psychological ones. Buying a home comes with significant upfront costs that people often overlook. Taxes, legal fees, inspections, maintenance. These are sunk costs. You don't get them back. On top of that, you tie up a large amount of capital in a single asset. That money could have been invested elsewhere. That opportunity cost matters. At the same time, homeownership can provide stability, control, and a sense of permanence that renting doesn't always offer. For many people, that peace of mind is worth the trade-offs. Renting, on the other hand, offers flexibility, lower responsibility, easier relocation, fewer unexpected costs. Financially, it can sometimes be the better choice, especially in expensive markets or during certain stages of life. The right decision depends on your timeline, your goals, the market conditions, and your lifestyle preferences. Buying isn't automatically better. Renting isn't automatically throwing money away. What matters is whether the choice supports the life you're trying to build. When you look at these decisions through the lens you've developed throughout this journey, they stop feeling overwhelming. You're no longer asking, "What should I do?" in isolation. You're asking, "How does this fit into my bigger picture?" And that's a far more empowering question. This is where everything comes together. The numbers, the systems, the timelines, the psychology. You're no longer reacting to money. You're integrating it into your life intentionally. The emotional shift at this stage is subtle but profound. It's not excitement or fear. It's calm. The sense that you're capable, that you don't need to have everything figured out right now, because you know how to adapt. You have a framework you can return to whenever things change. Money stops being something you avoid or obsess over. It becomes something you manage with clarity. And that clarity creates space for the rest of your life. Less anxiety, fewer surprises, more options. You don't need perfection. You don't need constant optimization. You need understanding, consistency, and patience. When those are in place, progress becomes inevitable. If there's one thing to take away from all of this, it's that financial literacy isn't about being rich. It's about being untrapped. It's about having the ability to make choices without fear constantly whispering in the background. And now you have the roadmap to do exactly that.